Today in Gaza, there's a ceasefire, not long-term peace, and I think we need to be clear about that. I mean, yes, big steps have been taken. Those should be celebrated, and the ceasefire is holding, but there's still a lot to be done before long-term peace is realistic. I mean, for starters, Hamas hasn't changed their ideology. They still have their weapons and are the de facto governing authority over much of the Gaza Strip. So to better understand where things sit today, we're joined by Mark Dubowitz, the CEO of Foundations for Defensive Democracies, a research institute focusing on national security and foreign policy. We get into the status of the ceasefire, what needs to happen for long-term peace to emerge, and some key impediments still ahead. You can learn more about FDD and follow Mark at the links in the description below. And with that, let's get to the conversation. All right, Mark, thank you so much for taking the time, sir. There's been a lot happening over the course of the last couple weeks, and I was really looking forward to your insight about what exactly, we're a weekend. What does the Gaza ceasefire look like today? Where do things stand?
So, Preston, first of all, thanks for having me on the show, and thank you for your service to our country.
I appreciate that.
Needs to be said and should be said more often to veterans like you. The Gaza ceasefire is a welcome end of war, at least for now. Certainly for the Israeli people, the Gazan people, and I think for the United States. And I think President Trump deserves enormous credit for getting us to this point. But we're a long way from a permanent ceasefire, and we're a long way from peace. We're the end of the beginning, as Winston Churchill used to say. And the end of the beginning is the return of the live hostages. It's worth mentioning that Hamas has so far reneged on their obligation to return all of the murdered hostages, all the bodies that are still in Gaza. And Hamas is also unleashed on Palestinians and has slaughtered dozens of Palestinians in the streets of Gaza. So President Trump has come out very clearly and forcefully to say this has got to stop. They've got to return the bodies. They got to stop killing Palestinians. And Hamas is going to have to move on to the next phase. And the most important element of the plan, without which nothing will occur, there will be no peace, there will be no stability, no prosperity, is the disarmament of Hamas. And so far you see Hamas coming out very strongly and saying they will not disarm.
That the pessimistic side of me, we've heard the ceasefire talk for so long now that I wasn't confident we were actually going to see the hostages come home. And when they did, I thought, all right, this is real. Like, there really might be traction here. What changed? It seems like Hamas, relatively quickly, that has been off the table, and then it was agreed to and carried out in a matter of 72 hours. Do you know where the pressure came from, or what changed from their perspective?
Yeah, it was a combination of, I think, three really important factors. The first is that the Israeli military launched a significant operation into Gaza City, which was the last stronghold of Hamas. They're sort of their Alamo. And they recognized with this major IDF operation going into Gaza City, the IDF was poised to destroy them militarily and remove this last vestige of Hamas control. The second major factor was that the Israeli Air Force went after Hamas leadership in Qatar, in Doha, to eliminate the top leadership that has been in Doha for many years. All of these men have become multi-billionaires, and they've been directing terrorist attacks and Hamas's activities from their luxury six-star hotels. And so these really said, that's it, that's enough. We're going after Hamas wherever they are. And they launched this airstrike. The airstrike was not successful in taking out Hamas leadership. It was very successful in sending a message to the Qataris that this is it. 2 years of the games are over. You are the ones that have massive influence over Hamas. You could have ended this war on the second day, right after October 7th. In fact, you could have prevented this war. And after 2 years of playing games, we're coming and striking in the heart of your country. And I think the Qataris realized the war is about to spread to Qatar, and they better put immense pressure on Hamas, which they did, along with the Turks. And the third is the indispensable role President Trump played. I think that I'd heard through various sources that Hamas had been hoping for a victory by Kamala Harris And when they didn't see a Harris victory and they saw President Trump coming in and right from the beginning being very, very aggressive and very supportive of Israel. He took a no daylight strategy, unlike the Biden administration, and he made it very clear I will support the Israelis. We may have tough conversations behind the scenes, but none of that's going to surface publicly. I'm going to give full throated support to the Israelis. And by the way, which he did during the Iran Israel war, I think that was a message to the Israelis I got your back, and I'm going to stop the most existential threat to you, which is the Islamic Republic of Iran. With all of that, he gained a huge amount of credibility in Israel and in the Arab world to be able to really knock heads together and get this deal done. So those three factors, I think, were all were critical in getting us to the ceasefire.
Well, that to expand out a little further, talking about the strikes in Iran and kind of the whole axis of resistance that has been pretty well handled, I would argue, in the last couple of years. Very different situation today than it was on October 7th. Is there much pressure on the pro-Hamas side? Do they feel like they have anywhere near the amount of maybe regional leverage that they once did between the Houthis and Hezbollah and Iran? Or is that a part of this as well, where they just maybe don't have the same support structure?
Yeah, Preston, you're right. I mean, I call it the axis of misery rather than the axis of resistance. The axis of misery has been severely degraded by Israeli military action and U.S. intervention to go after Iran's nuclear facilities. So if you look 2 years hence from October 7th, this axis that had been aligned against Israel and the United States, that had really encircled Israel on 7 fronts, has been dealt a severe blow. And I think for Hamas, looking out at their allies in Tehran, in Yemen, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, and across the region, they're looking at either regimes that are no longer there, like Assad's, regimes that have been severely weakened, like Khamenei's, and terrorist organizations that have sustained massive blows, like Hezbollah and increasingly like the Houthis. So I think the axis is no longer as robust and as deadly as it once was. I do think Hamas got a lot of energy, was really emboldened by what they saw around the world. When they saw massive protests in our streets in the United States, throughout Europe, Canada, Australia, these massive pro-Hamas rallies of people who were hardened pro-Hamas supporters, others who were pro-Palestinian supporters and sort of were giving Hamas a free pass, and others who were just, the usual useful idiots who don't really know what's going on, but never want to miss an opportunity to be on the streets, burning American flags and yelling, death to America, death to Israel. Hamas was very much emboldened by those massive protests. And they were very emboldened by the political support they got from a number of countries who declared preemptively, without conditions, their support for a Palestinian state, despite the fact that none of the conditions had been met for what a Palestinian state should look like, including the end of violence and terrorism. And Hamas would be the biggest beneficiary of those declarations. So they were getting a lot of political support from the West and from the sort of useful idiots. On the other hand, they were losing a lot of support in the region because of the axis of misery being severely degraded. And then as well, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Egyptians, the Jordanians are kind of moderating, saying this is enough. And then finally, President Trump putting pressure on the Turks and the Qataris, who are natural allies of Hamas, and saying, that's it, I've lost patience with Doha and with Ankara, and it's about time that you, that have the most leverage over Hamas, tell Hamas, that's it, ceasefire, hostages are coming back, and we're going to move to disarmament and the end of war.
Well, it was within the last month, I think, wasn't it, where a number of countries came out for the first time saying they were either recognizing or taking the steps to recognize a Palestinian state. And that was generally viewed as like it would hamper any sort of ceasefire negotiations. And I mean, it looks like that almost didn't have any impact at all. Or maybe I'm just downplaying the effect that did have.
Yeah, I mean, President Trump and Secretary of State Marco Rubio both came out publicly and actually called out these countries, the UK and France and Spain and others, and Canada, for having seriously undermined the negotiations, for emboldening Hamas, for giving Hamas the belief that they could continue to hang on, continue to not return the hostages, continue this war, and they would be getting more and more political support. I mean, from Hamas's perspective, Preston, it was interesting. The more recalcitrant they were, the more intransigent they were, the more political support they were getting. So obviously, it's just the wrong incentive structure, right? If the more intransigent you are, the more violent you are, the more unwilling you are to let the hostages go and end the war, the more political support you're getting from these Western countries and these people on the streets. No surprise that this thing has dragged on for 2 years. I think it was only when President Trump and Secretary Rubio, Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner said, you know what, that's it. We're pushing the Europeans aside. We don't care what the Europeans think. We don't care what the Canadians and Aussies and Irish think. We are going to build a regional coalition, and we're going to pull together the moderate Arab countries with the Turks and the Qataris, who are Muslim Brotherhood governments who support Hamas. We're going to pull them all together, and we're going to read Hamas the Riot Act as the IDF was moving into Gaza City and was starting to take over the last remaining vestige of Hamas control. Hamas finally said, "Uncle."
I feel like we're in a tough spot right now where it's you want to celebrate the wins and say this is great. The bullets have stopped flying by and large. There's aid going in. It looks like there's a path to potentially a path towards long-term peace. But you mentioned earlier this is not peace. This is a ceasefire. What are some of the impediments right now that need to be dealt with to actually consider something that might be long-term stable?
Yeah, listeners, that we actually had a ceasefire. We had a ceasefire on October 7th, 2023 between Israel and Hamas. And there had been a ceasefire in place, and then Hamas violated that ceasefire, launched this brutal invasion of Israel on October 7th, killing Israelis and Americans and others, taking hostage and rapes and tortures, and just a brutal, brutal invasion. It should remind us that this terrorist organization is not going to comply with its promises and its written commitments, that it is committed to jihad and it is committed to the destruction of Israel. So the impediments to a successful ceasefire and the impediments to translating that ceasefire into peace still remains Hamas's ideological commitment to the destruction of Israel. That ideological commitment is not going away. Anybody who thinks Hamas is going to reform is delusional. Anybody who thinks ISIS, do you think ISIS is going to reform? You think ISIS is going to give up their jihadist objectives? Do we think Al-Qaeda is all of a sudden going to become moderate Al-Qaeda? It's just worth remembering there is no difference between Al-Qaeda and ISIS and Hamas. They are dedicated, they're hard men with hard ideologies, and I think we need to have more respect for that, and not to think that somehow we can moderate them by giving them, land and peace and prosperity. That's not what they're interested in. The real key, since they're not going to abandon their ideology, is they got to abandon their weapons. They cannot have the weapons that they had on October 7th, right? They had spent years and billions of dollars of foreign money and U.S. taxpayer money creating the most dangerous urban warfare environment, I think, in the history of warfare. And you're a much deeper expert in warfare than I am, Preston. Both as a
nasty start to finish. Yeah,
God. 500 kilometers or 500 miles of terror tunnels, missiles, rockets, drones. And by the way, those terror tunnels were not created as bomb shelters for Gazans. Gazans were not put in the tunnels to protect them the way that Israelis went into shelters every day. Terrorists went into the bomb shelters, into the terror tunnels, and Gazans were meant to stay above ground and used as human shields against the IDF. So that urban warfare environment, I think, maybe Fallujah, maybe what happened in World War II as the Allies moved through Europe, maybe is a close parallel. But what the IDF had to deal with in that urban environment was really brutal. We need to ensure that entire environment, of terror tunnels and of weapons, is completely destroyed, because if Hamas retains any of it, They will reconstitute and they will be back. And they'll be back with Qatari and Turkish support. What we must not be deluded into thinking Turkey and Qatar are allies. These are all Muslim Brotherhood movements. Turkey, Qatar, and Hamas are all part of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Qataris and the Turks will do everything they can to reconstitute Hamas. So this is going to be up to Israel, the United States, the moderate Arab countries to ensure that Hamas is completely disarmed. And then I'll just say one other thing. In addition to being disarmed, they must also have no role in the governance of Gaza. Because if they control Gaza in any way, if they control the aid that's going into Gaza, if they control the police and the provision of services, then they will control the governance. And I think what Hamas is trying to do is either retain both the military and civilian governance of Gaza, or if they lose the civilian governance, then they want to retain the weapons, and they want to create basically a Hezbollah model that we saw in Lebanon, where you've got the civilians responsible for, taking out the garbage and health services and the economy, while Hezbollah sits in the shadows with its weapons. And that was very much the situation in Lebanon before the recent year, where Israel went in and really decapitated Hezbollah's leadership and gave the Lebanese government and the Lebanese armed forces the potential opportunity to take back Lebanon. Hamas will try to do the same thing in Gaza.
I mean, you talked about all of the pressure from different sources that came in to force Hamas to the negotiating table to accept the exchange or the release of the hostages in exchange for some Palestinians being held in Israel. Is the pressure enough, though? That seems like a big next step to either surrender entirely or give up their weapons. Is there enough pressure there now to get to that point, realistically?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I just want to remind everybody, the hostages are not all back. There's at least, 19, 20 murdered hostages, including 2 Americans who have not been returned in violation of Hamas's commitments. There weren't just some Palestinian, quote, prisoners. There were 2,000 that were released, including 250 who were serving multiple life sentences for multiple murders, for terrorist attacks that killed Israelis, Americans, and others. And so what Israel gave up in terms of the release of these 2,000 prisoners and 250 mass murderers is a massive risk that Israel is taking. I just want to remind your listeners that Yahya Sinwar, who was the head of Hamas's military wing, who launched the October 7th attack, was similarly given up in another hostage exchange that took place a number of years ago, where one Israeli soldier who was taken hostage by Hamas was released in exchange for hundreds of Palestinian prisoners who were released, including Yahya Sinwar, who was serving a sentence for mass murder of Palestinians, not Israelis. He was given.
I don't think I knew that.
Well, yeah.
Interesting.
That's why he was in an Israeli prison, for killing Palestinians. He had in that hostage release, they gave him up, and he became Yahya Sinwar, the military commander who launched October 7th. So massive risk for the Israelis in releasing all of these Palestinian terrorists. But the way forward is fraught, and I think it's going to be very, very important, and it's very, very difficult. But the president is going to have to maintain a real focus and a real attention on making sure that the 20 points in his peace plan are implemented. And it's going to require an enormous amount of his time and attention. And of course, the President of the United States is a busy man. He's got a lot of other things going on. But he's going to have to rely on Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner and on Marco Rubio and others to really take the time and the attention that is going to be required to hold Hamas accountable, to hold Turkey and Qatar accountable. And then the president's going to have to weigh in the way he has been over the past few days, where he puts out very specific truth posts. And you referenced one earlier, saying that at the end of the day, if Hamas doesn't do X, we're gonna wipe out Hamas. I'm going to unleash the Israeli military on Hamas. He's even hinted about some kind of American involvement in taking out Hamas. He's going to have to be very, very firm and very clear. Otherwise, Hamas will continue to play the games that they have for 4 decades. And the one thing they've done brilliantly, Preston, over 40 5 years is undermine all prospects for peace between Israelis and Palestinians.
Well, one of the challenges, and you were talking about this with President Trump's recent post, he was talking about Hamas killing Palestinians in Gaza. Can you tell us anything about that? It just seems like it came a little bit out of nowhere, like maybe Hamas was waiting for the IDF to withdraw, and we saw some nasty footage coming out.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned you that Hamas launched October 7th, who was in an Israeli jail for killing Palestinians. So Hamas has a long record, a 4-decade record of killing the Palestinian opposition to it. In fact, that's how it took power when the Israelis withdrew in around 2005, 2006. Israel withdrew from every inch of Gaza. There were elections there, and through intimidation and force and brutality, Hamas won those elections, and then they proceeded to murder members of the Palestinian Authority, right? And the PLO who were running against them, shooting them in kneecaps, throwing them off tops of buildings. And that's how they took power and consolidated power for the next almost 20 years. So Hamas has a long track record of killing Palestinians. And we saw that, all through the 2-year war. They were killing Palestinians, accusing them of being, quote, collaborators. Collaborators meaning anybody that opposes them is all of a sudden a collaborator. And they've been shooting them and executing them in public. And then we saw, an eruption of that right after the ceasefire, where now that the IDF wasn't there in certain areas, Hamas went in there, went after their opponents, and, as you say, slaughtered them in really horrific ways. And that's what President Trump was responding to, say, enough of that. That's unacceptable, and it is a violation of the terms of the ceasefire.
Is there a viable alternative to Hamas in Gaza right now? Or do you expect there to be one sometime soon?
Americans, we're good optimists, right? I think that's what makes us American. I'd like to think that there is the possibility that if we actually disarm Hamas, and then if we remove Hamas from governance, and then if we as Americans and the regional actors, and we're serious, we do what's necessary, there could emerge a Palestinian alternative that is more pragmatic, moderate, and committed to peace and prosperity. I hope so, but I think as somebody who's been following the Middle East, I guess for 45 years, since I was a kid, and more closely professionally over the past 22 years, I'm skeptical that we're going to see some kind of moderate alternative to Hamas. The Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, right, which could be the alternative, has shown itself to be corrupt, incompetent, and completely incapable of governing the large amounts of territory that it has control over. I mean, it's part of the Oslo peace process. A lot of history here, but as part of the Oslo peace process, Israel withdrew from major areas of the West Bank and handed that over to the Palestinian Authority to rule. And they've done a remarkably poor job of ruling those Palestinian territories. And, the Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority, I don't know if I've lost track. I think he's on his 18th or 19th year of his 4-year term. So, Palestinian democracy ain't exactly thriving in the West Bank. Huge corruption. He's deeply unpopular. I think Hamas is more popular in the West Bank today than the Palestinian Authority. So the notion that the Palestinian Authority, after screwing up the West Bank, can then come into Gaza and take that over and turn that into something peaceful, maybe fanciful. Hope springs eternal. Maybe they will. Maybe they'll reform themselves. And I hope this was the case, that Gazans who've gone through now 20 years of hell living under Hamas rule and 2 years of brutal war will finally say, we've had it. That's it. We want a better life. And they will move against Hamas and take advantage of the opportunity to start to build something better. But they've got no chance against Hamas if Hamas has the weapons, and they're just brutally slaughtered on the streets if they show any opposition.
All right, well, we'll get the disarmament complete. Hamas will step out of power, and then it'll clear the path for something new in Gaza, general peace in the region. We'll try to end it on that note. Mark, thank you so much for taking the time, sir. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Preston.
So thank you again so much to Mark for taking the time to walk through all of that. I've been a consumer of FDD's products for quite a while now. Generation Jihad is like one of my go-to podcasts and has been for years on end. We've had Joe Truzman from FDD over here on the channel before to talk about Hamas and the war in Gaza and the broader war throughout the Middle East. So incredible wealth of knowledge over there, not just with Mark and Joe, but the entire team at FDD. Be sure to check out all that they're doing, including some of their podcasts. We'll throw some of those links in the description below as well. But that's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.